I welcome the opportunity to debate this motion so ably proposed by Deputy Funchion, and my Labour colleagues and I were happy to co-sign it to render it truly a cross-party motion. And Minister, just to welcome your announcement that the government wouldn't be opposing it. I think that's a really welcome approach to take, and indeed look forward to further constructive engagement on the legislation that will be introduced in the new year that you've described to form the basis for the scheme. I think this is a genuine attempt to work to strengthen and improve the redress scheme, and I know that it is appropriate. I think that's what survivors would want, that we would all work on a cross-party and collaborative basis. Many of us have received emails and contacts from survivors and their families who have eloquently conveyed their feelings and experiences, and indeed we've all heard the very powerful voices of survivors. And just to pay tribute to the incredible women like Catherine Corliss, former Taoiseach, to Joan Burton, Christine Buckley, Rose and late Christine Buckley, Rose and Mags McKinney, Susan Lohan, Anna Mara, Samantha Long, and all those who used their voices so bravely in pursuing justice and who've spoken out about the injustices that they've experienced. So we owe them this approach, this collaborative approach, to ensure that their trauma doesn't become a political football, and that we can move forward in a non-adversarial fashion on this. And I do want to first just express my own sympathies, as well as those of my Labour colleagues, to all those who experienced suffering and distress in the Mother and Baby County and Bethany homes. Looking at the report, since January when it was published, the report of the Commission has certainly generated an intense debate, and a debate that's been both painful and indeed cathartic for survivors as well as for our society more generally. And indeed it's built on the reports on other shameful institutional practices in our state, like the Ryan Commission report, like the Murphy report, like so many of these reports that exposed the abuses to which women and children in particular were exposed in so many institutions over a relatively short history. Our history of institutional abuse indeed is horrific. We have incarcerated people, women and children in particular, for far too long, and the witness evidence in the report really exposed the violations of human rights of so many. We know that a total of 56,000 mothers and 57,000 children passed through the institutions in the decades examined. Thousands more were resident in other institutions outside the terms of remit of the Commission. A shocking mortality rate for infants was exposed in the report. 9,000 infants and babies in the homes covered by the report died before their first birthday. As I say, a really shocking rate of 15%, or 1 in 7. And within the confidential committee section in particular, we learned of the true extent of abuse suffered by survivors, physical and psychological. Also the widespread practice of forced labour and the extensive practice of coerced or forced adoption. So I think we're all conscious that, as you've acknowledged, Minister, there can be no quantification on the distress and trauma caused, and it's very difficult to place a price, indeed probably impossible to place any sort of price on what is owed to survivors by the state, religious orders and all those complicit, including of course pharmaceutical companies, and I do want to refer to that. In my previous life as a barrister, I had the privilege of representing survivors of abuse before the Residential Institutions Redress Board. So I have experience of working within one of those redress schemes. First, I learned from so many the terrible harms they had suffered at those institutions, but I also witnessed the flaws that were in that system. And I think we've clearly learnt from that scheme. It essentially institutionalised a hierarchy of suffering, in that it required survivors to provide evidence of harm and abuse suffered in institutions, and in order to achieve a certain level of compensation. And it was a very difficult, very traumatic process to appear before the board for those survivors who did so. Many of them told me they felt it was pitting survivors against each other, so that was a really re-traumatising impact. And I think, having seen that in effect, and it was obviously devised with the best of intentions, and yet we see therefore how difficult it is to develop an effective or robust compensation scheme. And I think, learning from that, there are many aspects of this redress scheme that are very welcome and that clearly are a great improvement. The scale of the scheme is hugely welcome. 34,000 survivors eligible for financial payments, 19,000 for an enhanced medical card. It is to be non-adversarial. That's very welcome. It is to be accessible, and there's no requirement to submit evidence of abuse or harm caused. And again, I think that's really welcome. There's no requirement of silence, as I understand, and that again is very welcome, because that was a really unfortunate facet of the previous scheme. So those are all the welcome aspects. But of course, there are also critiques that have been expressed in recent days, and I think they're very valid ones, because there are still a number of people who will be excluded. While it's great that women survivors who live abroad will qualify, as well as those who spent less than 6 months in the institutions, we still see a distinction where children who spent less than 6 months will be ineligible for payment, as will children who were boarded out unless they spent their first 6 months in an institution. And of course, we've seen excluded from the enhanced medical card scheme women who spent less than 6 months in an institution. And that's really regrettable, particularly as many of those women will have arrived at the institutions in late stages of pregnancy. And we have heard from many who did suffer physical harm, medical harm as a result of incarceration. And indeed, back on the 26th of February of this year, this Dáil Éireann passed an amendment from my colleague, Labour Deputy Sean Sherlock, to give an entitlement to a medical card for all former residents of mother and baby in county homes. And I would ask, Minister, that you would consider giving effect to this amendment, to that intention of the Dáil, as expressed following a very constructive debate that day. And indeed, that's something that others have also sought, and it's called for in the motion. Many survivors have also expressed concern about the timeline for redress, and concerns that if the scheme doesn't open until late 2022, payments may not be expected until 2023. And I would ask, Minister, that you might examine the feasibility of a programme of interim payments to survivors, such as in the North. I know you've said you will prioritise older and vulnerable survivors, but there is that other mechanism of an interim payment scheme that might well meet some needs of survivors. I do also want to just address the point you raised in your own speech as to who pays for the scheme and the role of the religious orders. And we know, of course, that the executive summary of the Commission's report was widely criticised for spreading blame perhaps too broadly beyond state and church, and saying responsibility rests mainly with fathers and immediate families. And I think we do need to re-emphasise the causative role of both state and church authorities. We know how powerful the church was for so many of the decades in which these institutions prevailed, and we know that the church was also, through its ethical and moral and teaching of dogma, was directly responsible for generating the moral context in which shame and secrecy prevailed for so many who were incarcerated in the homes. We know that not until Labour's Frank Cluskey introduced what was called then the Unmarried Mothers Allowance in 1973 did the state take any responsibility for women who had been so shamefully neglected for so many decades, and not until 1987 did we finally pass laws to abolish the status of illegitimacy. So state and church bear huge responsibility for the suffering of women in these institutions, and indeed not just the Catholic Church, but we know also Protestant churches which had a role in incarceration. And we know also that there was obstructiveness displayed by some of the orders involved during the compilation of the report, and that has certainly been made public. So we do need to see, therefore, a much greater role for religious orders in bearing financial cost of redress. And again, just to refer to the residential institution redress scheme and how the well-known failure of church and religious orders there to pay what was their fair share of redress, leaving the state to bear the disproportionate cost of the scheme, and the reasons for that have been well aired in this House and elsewhere. So we in Labour have called for religious institutions to make a fair and proportionate contribution to this redress, and I know, Minister, you've stated your intention that they would do so. If they don't, then we've committed to drafting legislation to compel them to make a contribution. I hope it won't come to that, because I do think, again, we've learned from the experiences of the past. And I do think we also need to look at the role of private capital in the system of abuse. In Chapter 34 of the Commission's report, the issue of vaccine trials was discussed in great detail. And it's really disappointing to learn that pharmaceutical companies which were involved in those trials do not see it apparently as necessary to make a financial contribution. And again, I would ask, Minister, that we might look again at that. And we must also acknowledge, of course, that there are many other measures that are crucial for survivors. The Adoption Information and Tracing Bill that our committee is currently reviewing, and of course what we think should be done, a comprehensive review of adoption practices in this country to ensure that we are dealing truly with the legacy of the past, that we're looking at issues around illegal adoptions in particular, and looking at these issues of forced and coerced adoptions, and indeed falsified birth certificates. So we need, Minister, to work constructively with you, and we certainly intend to do so, to ensure the strengthening of this redress scheme, but also that these other measures that are so sorely needed by survivors survivors are also put in place. And I look forward to doing so, and I'm glad that we'll see no vote on the motion, which has cross-party support.